Welcome. We'll get started. I'm Dr. Bircher.
And I'm Dr. Bauer.
And
Welcome,
tonight,
everybody.
we're going to talk about neurofeedback as it relates to attention deficit, and also as it relates to other brain function things that we do with neurofeedback. Just a quick thing about myself. I'm a chiropractor and a functional neurologist with extra training in neurology, nutrition, and lab test interpretation. Been in practice for 33 years,
And as you can see, we both have relatively similar backgrounds. We both did some training beyond our chiropractic because we recognized that there was a little bit more than just the spinal component, but more of a nutritional component and a number of different tools that we could use to be able to evaluate a person's health beyond just the spine. And so that led us to more in-depth studies of the brain and how it functions, and how we may use some more natural interventions to have an influence on how the brain functions without having to use medications. And as you said, I'd say you and I have at least 1,000 hours or more in studies of nutrition and laboratory. So, and I've been in practice for almost 19 years now. So we have Dr. Bircher is going to make a little switch here. We have a presentation embedded within the presentation here, and we have to switch formats. A little technical difficulty, but anyway, I mean, how many of you folks have heard of neurofeedback? I mean, is that something that folks have heard about? Okay, have you heard positive or negative or indifferent, or any people have had family members who've experienced it, or things of that nature? Anybody willing to speak up? Combination? Sure. Well, you know, the long and short of it is you know, what we hope to be able to do here is define for you, take maybe a little some of the mystery out of what neurofeedback is. My experience in 20 years of working with people is that what people don't understand, they oftentimes fill in with their own information, and oftentimes that information is incorrect. So, you know, we always do our best to try and give people some information that they can then make an informed decision on, and hopefully spring them in a direction that will lead them towards better health. So,
well, we're going to just start off with a general information about what is neurofeedback and when is it used. First of all, a little history behind biofeedback and neurofeedback. It's been around since the 30s. There are literally thousands of research articles on neurofeedback and biofeedback, and we'll get into some of those articles later on in the presentation. But it has lots of research behind it. There's lots of studies that show the efficacy and virtually no side effects. And something that has that in science really should stand out more. And the question comes up when we talk about this, well, if it's something that's that effective and that good, why isn't it more commonly used? And the best answer I can give is that there's no drugs to be sold in neurofeedback, and so it's not used very much. But it's very effective. It is used all over the world, and we'll show some areas where it is used in this country. And basically it's a way to train the brain to alter the structure and function of the brain by using brainwave biofeedback. And later on we'll get into studies that show that they actually did scans of the brain, and when you train your brain, it actually grows bigger, even at we'll say advanced ages. Even into the 80s, you can do neurofeedback, and they've measured that the brain that you use, that part of the brain, it will increase function and actually grow. And the opposite is also true. Your nervous system is very much a use it or lose it system. All of our body functions are. If you don't use it, you tend to lose it over time. And brains tend to shrink as people get older if they do. So the most common things that it's used for is ADHD, traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety is a common one, and depression. And we'll get some studies on those in just a minute. So how is it done? We hook up actually leads to different parts of the brain that we're trying to train, so that the brain is sending a signal to the computer, and the computer is measuring the brain waves coming off of the brain, and we can use a reward system to, when the brain gets something that it wants, it will tend to tune into that and do more of it. And when it doesn't work, it tends to do less of that. So this particular example, someone's hooked up and they're watching a movie. And when we have, let's say that we want to get the brain waves at a certain frequency, and the brain waves are at 25 hertz and we want to get it down to 18, what happens is that the movie screen tends to get dimmer and the sound of the movie goes down. And the brain is hardwired to learn and to get what it wants. So your brain searches, and so the brain goes, well, I want to watch this movie and it's getting darker. So I'm going to switch to 27 hertz and see what happens, and try harder. Well, at 27 hertz, the screen actually gets dimmer and the sound goes down, so the brain goes, oh, that was the wrong way. I'm going to go to 22 hertz and see what happens. And it gets brighter, sound goes up, and the brain goes, I'm heading in the right direction. So then it varies a little bit. The brain goes down to 20 and then to 18, and it's full screen, the sound is full, and so the brain learns to move to 18 hertz to get what it wants. And so it's called operant conditioning. It's just your brain tends to go towards something that is a reward, something that the brain wants.
Should we have questions there?
So,
Oh yeah, we'll have time at the end for questions. So you can write questions down and we'll get to
yeah,
them.
we'll get to those at the end. We'll leave some time. We'll try and be as, how would I say, straightforward and to the point as possible, so we can have some time there. But then, as Dr. Bircher was saying, operant conditioning is essentially a reward for doing well, or for meeting a particular goal, and the reward process is called basically a positive reinforcement. They've actually done studies with operant conditioning where they did it with cats, where they gave the cat the reward, and they looked at the brain, and they saw that the cats could learn from this reward, and when they didn't do what was right, then there was kind of a it's a reward punishment, so to speak. Not necessarily that you get like an electric shock or anything like that, but as Dr. Bircher was describing, when the brain sees that this isn't, I can't hear it, and I can't see this at full brightness, the brain adjusts and makes changes unconsciously. Much of the time, the people that we've worked through this, there was a gentleman I was talking to yesterday, and people think that they have to do something. They've got to think about something, or they have to effort in some way to make it happen. And that is not how neurofeedback works. It's an unconscious process that the brain learns from that positive feedback. And it's really the same thing as, like it's giving the example here of riding a bicycle. Once we learn to ride the bicycle, if we have the punishment of falling off the bike and skinning up our knee, if we had the courage to move forward and get back on the bike again, eventually the muscle tone and the balance and knowing the right things to do, your brain learns how to do that. And then once you learn how to ride that bicycle, you really never forget, unless you have some type of a traumatic brain injury or something that makes it so that your muscles don't remember the things that they learned, and then you have to relearn those things.
Now, the studies that have been done, it says on here that they continue up to 30 years, and it also said above that it becomes a permanent part of our behavior. And the reason it says up to 30 years is because that's all along with the studies that have been done on this. So as far as I can tell, once you learn to do something, it is permanent. And typically, how long does it take? It says 20 to 40 sessions. We usually recommend twice a week. Each session takes about 30 minutes. And the brain, it takes just like anything we learn, like riding a bike, learning how to walk, it takes a while, and the brain will continue to learn, and we can keep going in that process. And we also do questionnaires of symptoms, and this is just an example of somebody who did 10 to 20 sessions, and there's negative symptoms. It's kind of hard to read the graph because it's small, but you can see that the negative symptoms on top, the bars are high, but after the training, the negative symptoms went down and the positive symptoms improved.
Essentially, from here on down, these are the positive symptoms. Here on down, positive symptoms, and the negatives are on the top here. So essentially, through a questionnaire process, we can not only track from a brain standpoint or being able to see some measurable changes in the brain, but we also, you know, we've always said it doesn't make any difference what information looks like, whether it be a lab test or a brain test. If things look better and people don't feel better, then what have we really accomplished? So we like to combine those things together to make sure that, you know, the influences that we're having are both positive in ways that we can see objectively, in other words, the brain map, but also subjectively in what the patient feels.
So it says some individuals feel changes in 1 to 5 sessions. I would say most don't. It takes a few. And I did have one guy, and I asked him after 10 sessions if he noticed any difference, and he said, I don't notice any difference, but my family says I'm nicer.
That counts.
Exactly, and the importance of this is to understand that just like we vary as people in personality, there are different responses and different levels of sensitivity. It's very similar to some individuals will respond to a lower dose of medication because they are sensitive to those medications, and but another person may need a larger dose of that same medication to achieve the same effect. Different individuals have different levels of sensitivity, and as Dr. Bircher said, you know, there's some individuals who subjectively, they may not feel a whole lot taking place after 5 or 6 sessions, but another person, we've had a few folks who say very simply that they felt an effect immediately after the first time they had it done. So it varies from person to person, and that's an important thing. One of the most important jobs of a doctor is to manage expectations and have people, whoever is involved in anything, to have them understand that there can be fluctuations in how someone would respond to this. So
This is just a bigger picture of the symptom.
So this is actually the study that was done by Beauregard and Levesque, and this was actually the study that was done and really had a positive influence on the American Academy of Pediatrics. The American Academy of Pediatrics, I think it was in 2012 or 2013, moved neurofeedback up into what they call a level 1 intervention. And a level 1 intervention is essentially an equivalent to medication. So they're seeing, what it really boils down to is that the influence that they saw and the influence that they see the neurofeedback having on children with attention deficit and attention deficit disorder had similar effects to the common drugs that are used to treat children with ADD, and that's significant.
So here's just some success rates just using neurofeedback. Depression, 90%, ADD and ADHD, 90%. OCD, which we see a few kids right now with that, 70% anxiety, bipolar, autism. Bipolar and autism, the percentages are lower because there's more things going on. The brain has some structural, chemical problems, and so it's harder to make changes with neurofeedback when you have. But most depression, the brain's working pretty well. Same thing with ADHD. The structure of the brain's okay, and we'll get some pictures later where they actually took MRIs of the brain, and I just had somebody here actually today who had a work injury where he got hit in the head, and they did an MRI of the brain and didn't show any structural problems, but we did a brain map and there's all kinds of things going on. Because in MRI, the structure of the brain doesn't have to be altered for brain function to be altered. So what we're measuring, and we'll get to that in a minute, is the volume of electricity coming off the brain in 10 different areas. So we measure symptoms, and these are typical changes in kids with ADHD, improvements, and another one that was a kind of a byproduct, which they didn't predict, was IQ, 10 to 15 points increase, doing neurofeedback. And how that happens is very simply by balancing brain function and making better connections in the brain becomes more efficient. Reduce medications, and most of the time off medications completely. So here's some pictures of brain and some ideas of different areas of the brain are overactive, some are underactive. So it just shows that sometimes the brain's going too fast in the front, too slow in the back. Brain's too slow in the front. We're going to get to some, this just talks about optimal is balance. We need the brain to not go too fast or too slow. We want it to be in a normal range so that when we're centered, the brain needs to go fast, it can. When it needs to slow down, the brain can do that. It can adapt to the situation that you're in. So here's an example of a picture. The top one on the right-hand side is what the brain map actually looks like. It's different colors, and the colors mean, and then the one below just shows the color changes in the whole, across the whole head, but what we're doing is 10 different specific areas of the brain. And this is a picture of how we actually do the map. There's a little hat that someone puts on. There's 10 different leads in there. It's non-invasive. The little points in that hat are measuring electricity coming off of the brain, not putting any in. It's accurate. We have a, on the computer screen when we hook somebody up, there's bar graphs on the sides of the screen that actually measure the contacts to the head to make sure that the testing is accurate within our center tube. And that those graphs are running all the time, so in case somebody bumps something loose, that will show up and will stop the test, so we know and we can watch the test that it's accurate. And it's widely used, like I said, research around the world. Here's the example of MRI. You can find abnormalities in the brain that show up on those MRI pictures of the brain. And then if you correlate to the brain map, they do correlate. We'll find that when there's actually, you'll see these little lesions in the brain, see how it looks different. Up here, you know, there's been a brain injury that caused some damage. That will show up on the map also. And this is what our map that we do when we show people here what the map actually looks like. And as you'll see, at the top it says magnitude, and what that means is that we're measuring the volume or the magnitude of electrical signals coming off the brain. And we have a graph on the side of each one where it says green is okay, red's high, yellow is very high, a stronger signal than normal, green is normal, and then light blue and dark blue signals are too low. And then, so those 10 areas we measure are on there, and the dots are color coded. And you'll see 4 different heads, and those have to do with the frequency of that electricity. So I use the analogy of a radio station. You can have 88.3 on the dial, and the signal strength can be a 10, but you change to 96.7, you're on a different station, but the signal strength is the same. So these different frequencies have to do with, delta has to do with sleep, theta is more of a meditative state, alpha is more of a focused learning state, and beta, busy brain, high energy thinking, doing a lot of things at once. One example, you're driving your car. Here, you have to watch traffic and watch for signs. Your brain is busier. So it's low frequency on the left-hand side of delta, and across beta is a higher frequency. The brain is working harder and faster.
And essentially what I think the important thing for folks to understand is that there tend to be certain patterns of imbalances that will show up in different conditions. So we're simply, in this case, we're talking about ADD or ADHD. A common ADD, ADHD pattern is where you have high theta and you have a lower amount of beta in the brain. So essentially what's happening, the theta is a lower frequency wave. And so if you can understand that if you're supposed to be at a high frequency, but the lower frequency is dominant, essentially what ends up happening in kids with ADD or ADHD is there's all kinds of activity that tends to be created to try and get more of that beta waking up. They're half asleep, and that's why a lot of those stimulants like Ritalin and those types of things work, because children with ADHD or ADD, their brain is literally half asleep, and the stimulant brings it up to a higher level. That's why those drugs work. But the beautiful thing about neurofeedback is that you can use this tool to essentially turn the dial down in one area and turn the dial up in another area, and be able to have an intervention that doesn't require the medication to increase that beta and lower the theta down. Am I making sense? Okay, and it's a longer term. Well, ultimately, it's a longer term fix. Using the Ritalin gives that temporary stimulation, but as soon as we take away the medication, then of course the behavior returns. So changing the brain is the ultimate solution.
And the long-term studies that were done comparing medication to neurofeedback, all the studies showed that when you take the medication away, the gains that were made, because there's no doubt about it, kids who take the medication do function better, because Ritalin is a stimulant and it raises the beta waves in the brain, so the brain can actually focus on a task and do it better. And logic would say, well, if they're already hyperactive, why would you give them stimulants? But when you understand that the beta waves are too low, then taking a stimulant and raises those, that makes some more sense. But again, most of the gains that are lost by taking medication, the gains that are made taking medication are lost when you take it away. Whereas neurofeedback, they're permanent with no side effects. So we also, this is just a picture of symptom correlation. We do a questionnaire when we do the map. We do a questionnaire again later on, usually at 10 or 20 visits, and we compare them because we have some people who are unaware of how they feel. I had somebody, we did 10 sessions, and we asked them how they think they're doing. Well, I don't notice any difference. We had them fill out a questionnaire, and then we compared the first session and the 10th session questionnaire, and we said, look at the difference. This one's better, this one's better, and this one's better. And they went, oh yeah, I guess it is. They don't notice because the changes are slow. So doing the questionnaires along with the brain map have been very effective. These are just some examples of depression and anxiety brain maps prior to therapy and then after therapy, and they're kind of small, so they're hard to read.
And it's kind of difficult to see, but I mean, essentially what we see is we see some yellows here and reds. We see quite a few, we see yellow and quite a few reds here. A very common anxiety pattern. High alpha tends to be a very common anxiety pattern for folks who are struggling with chronic anxiety. But if we take a look over to the map on the right, which is post-neurofeedback reading, we see that these yellows here, we've got a red here, but the reds are green, yellow is green, and then all the reds and yellows here are all green. So essentially what we see is that the person's brain has been trained down to lower that high alpha, and as we said, that high alpha is something that oftentimes correlates with a symptom of more anxiety. So if we see that change, we also expect to see a change in the anxiety as well.
So the questionnaire can be filled out. We usually do it here. It's possible to do it from home, and these are just some examples of the questionnaires, the questions that are on them. And there's, then we get a report from those questionnaires, and we match that up with a brain map. And there's some recommendations for protocols made from the map and the questionnaires.
Right. And I think it's very important, another important point that I'd like to get across to folks is that, you know, that we always tell folks that there is not a person out there who has an absolutely perfect map. You know, there are going to be some discrepancies in just about any brain that we evaluate, but there are certain times when it's better to have a brain map done than others. We typically tend to prefer to do it before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It's better to do those in the morning, okay? The other thing to understand is that, you know, what we're looking for is we're looking for extremes. We're looking for extremes, and we're looking for patterns that tend to correlate with whatever symptom pattern the patient is working with. And that's really the job of neurofeedback, is to normalize patterns and balance the extremes. That's what it boils down to here. And the main situation that we always talk to people about is that, you know, who does neurofeedback work with? It works for everybody. It's just a matter of how extreme the symptoms are, and it's obviously it's a whole lot easier if somebody is in an extreme situation where they have extreme anxiety or extreme ADHD or things of that nature. That it's easier to see that change happen more rapidly because it's such an extreme. But for an individual who is just looking to try and improve their brain function, this is literally just it's a workout for your brain. It makes your brain exercise in ways that people sometimes do not challenge their brains, and by doing so, they just simply keep the brain sharp and on task and able to perform the functions that our brain do.
Well, one of the things that he mentioned is that we see patterns on the brain map that correlate with different anxiety, depression, ADHD. And one of the things that our brains are creatures of habits. And once we create a habit, we get used to that, and we naturally don't do things to change our habits. It's just human nature. And so when we do a brain map and we find the imbalances, we can tune into one part of the brain is too slow or too fast. We can hook the leads up, the neurofeedback leads to that particular area of the brain and focus on that spot to improve the cognitive function or memory, attention, whatever the issues are. So we can make it very specific. And then this is just an example of a bar graph. We do a graph over time of symptoms, but we just have, I said hundreds of research projects. There's some of the latest ones. But one of the things that I think stands out is a group, the Pediatric Association, the national one, looked at neurofeedback and raised it to a level 1 treatment option because it meets all the scientific criteria of being something that works for 90% of the people. There's no side effects, no medications. So one of the logical questions is why isn't it used more? And it's just, as I said a minute ago, our brains have habit patterns. Healthcare and medicine has habit patterns too. They just have a habit pattern of prescribing Ritalin, and they just don't, this isn't in their habit pattern yet. But the science is there, the results are there, it will change over time.